If you look at a map of the second most spoken language by state, you'll see that most US states speak Spanish as their second language. To most Americans, that's not at all interesting. What is interesting, however, is the states that don't. Alaska and Hawaii are far away, so this seems intuitive, and northern New England borders Quebec, so French seems to be a reasonable second language for them. But the really interesting one is Louisiana. What's happening down here, and why do they speak French? To understand why Louisianans speak French, we need to go back to the age of colonialism. Back in 1750, Louisiana and Quebec were the only real population centers in French North America, where French immigrants moved in significant enough numbers and where French was a widely spoken language. Despite the large size of French North America on most maps, it was sparsely populated and most of it was not settled by the French. However, knowing that Louisiana and Quebec were the population centers in the colonial era, it's tempting to assume that Louisiana is like Quebec, only in America and in a much, much warmer climate. While tempting, this wouldn't be true, as Louisiana and Quebec had very different historical trajectories. Louisiana isn't just like Quebec in America. We saw that earlier when we saw that English was the second most spoken language of Quebec, while French is the second most spoken language of Louisiana. Only about 7% of Louisianans speak French, which is the highest percentage in all of America, but still much lower than the rate in Quebec. And in case you're wondering, 7% is higher than all but two Canadian provinces. Only Quebec itself and New Brunswick in Canada have higher rates. This makes Louisiana unique not just amongst American states, but would even be unique by the standards of Canadian provinces. So why did Quebec end up retaining its French influence and language while Louisiana lost theirs, at least in part? Well, to understand that, we need to see what happened to Louisiana after the fall of French North America. In the 1760s, France lost the Seven Years' War, which resulted in them ceding, among other things, all of Canada and the eastern Louisiana Territory to the British. Note here that this meant that Quebec was now entirely in the hands of Britain, but the eastern Louisiana Territory only included a small part of present-day Louisiana, and not New Orleans. This meant that Louisiana, including New Orleans, was ceded to Spain for now. Spain would eventually return Louisiana to France in 1801 during the Napoleonic era. However, French rule didn't last, and in 1803, Robert Livingston, who I mentioned in my Founding Fathers video, negotiated the Louisiana Purchase from France, thus bringing most of modern-day Louisiana, and most importantly, New Orleans, under American control. This is where Quebec and Louisiana really get set on different trajectories, as Quebec is part of the British Empire in 1803, and has been for decades. Louisiana is now in its third nation, and its people reflect this. At the time, the population of the territory, not counting Native Americans, was about 60,000, roughly half of them being slaves, about 1 in 6 being Acadians, who fled from British Canada. In addition, there were notable Spanish, German, and American communities. This meant that Louisiana from the early days was a very diverse place, and that unlike Quebec, this meant that while French was a commonly spoken language, it wasn't necessarily everybody's first language. Under early American rule, French remained the common language. However, by the time of the 1845 Constitution, French was in the minority, except in some cities like New Orleans. The Constitution passed in that year provided some protections for the French population, but French was decidedly no longer the lingua franca. The Constitution is similar to, say, the Quebec Act of 1774 in that it provides some protections to the French population living there, such as laws having to be written in French also. However, English Canadians did not move en masse to Quebec in the same way that Americans did to Louisiana. This left Louisiana with a dominant Southern American population. Hence, these protections for the French language would not last in Louisiana. With the 1865 and 1868 constitutions in the aftermath of the Civil War, repealing some of the protections that French had enjoyed under the original Constitution. In 1879, some of these restrictions were repealed or replaced, but they were not completely repealed. An example of this would be the writing of laws in French. The post-Civil War Constitution had forbid this act. However, the 1879 Constitution allowed the legislature to choose to publish some laws in French on a case-by-case basis if they chose to do so. This allowed them to publish some laws in French, but it never made it mandatory again. Unfortunately, the early 20th century would not bring relief to Louisiana's French. The Constitution was changed yet again in 1921 with strict anti-French language laws. Corporal punishment was used on French children in an attempt to assimilate them, and an attitude among the public was anti-Cajun French, with a Speak White campaign fostering racist attitudes towards Cajuns on the grounds that French speakers were not truly white. This led to a dramatic decline in French speakers in Louisiana. At the same time, the World Wars led to a sense of national unity and national identity that hadn't really included Louisiana's French speakers before. This increased assimilation and decreased French language speakers. In fact, World War II coincides with the biggest decline in French speakers in Louisiana ever. By the late 60s, early 70s, the civil rights movement had come to Louisiana in support of the French-speaking population. And at that time, 28% of Louisianans still spoke French. However, this was primarily among the older generations, and French as a language would continue to see steady declines throughout the second half of the 20th century. Although the language was still in decline, it was no longer being persecuted, with Caudifiel working on preserving the French language by publishing the first Cajun French dictionary and implementing French government services. While government services have been mandated to be offered in French since 2011, the state government never fully funded this effort, and the program continues to lag to this day. Despite the historic declines, French is still widely spoken in Louisiana, and as I mentioned at the beginning, Louisiana still has more French speakers than any other state in the Union. Louisiana has instituted French language immersion schools to keep the language alive, and in 2018, Louisiana joined the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, which has supported French language programs. However, since the Louisiana dialect of French was primarily preserved by the older generations and not passed down, the French being promoted in these schools is standard French, and has led to the Louisiana dialect slowly fading, despite more people speaking French overall. It seems clear that the story of French in Louisiana is far from over, but the French of Louisiana has clearly had a very unique journey to get to this point, a journey that is far different from any other state or Canadian province. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, leave a like.